Good evening and welcome to tonight's CAOMS educational webinar. What better way to bring on this 2021 educational webinar series than by having one of our own CAOMS executive members present to us tonight. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please make sure your microphone is muted and your video is turned off. Once again, please make sure your microphone is muted and your video is turned off. During the presentation, questions can be sent directly to Dr. Tony Chahadi, who's going to be once again our moderator this evening. You can send your questions to him via the chat function, and Tony will moderate the Q&A at the end of the presentation. At the conclusion of the session, we will offer anyone who wishes to open up their camera and their microphone the opportunity for a brief social, as we've done in the past. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to thank Vanessa Bourgeois, General Manager of Canada for Nobel Biocare, and her entire team, including Mary Romano, Senior Training and Educational Manager, and all the sales rep that are going to join us this evening for this presentation. Nobel Biocare has been a long supporter of the CAOMS, and unfortunately with little opportunity for any of us to see our Nobel reps or engage in social activities with them at our annual meeting, this is one of the only ways that we can reach out to them. So please sit and relax and watch this short video supplied to us by Nobel Biocare. Thank you. Once again, thank you very, very much to Nobel Biocare for sponsoring tonight's webinar. Thank you to Vanessa Bourgeois for offering for this sponsorship and allowing us to showcase one of our own with Steve. So with this, I'd like to introduce our speaker to tonight. It is Dr. Stephen Ho from Ontario. Dr. Ho, as many of you know, completed dental school and his oral maxillofacial surgical training at the University of Toronto. He's taken postgraduate medical education in sleep apnea diagnosis and treatment, and he has tried to focus his expertise in OSA management in the Ontario region. He has expertise in 3D treatment planning. He's participated as a lecturer and consultant through a program that he developed called CVOS, Oral Surgery Sleep Treatment Clinic, in 2009. He has access to level 3 home sleep testing that does not require the patient to visit a sleep lab. He's involved in research, product development, and really has a keen focus in OSA management, as well as implant surgical navigation and 3D printing. Since 2016, Steve has been on our CAOMS executive as the Ontario Regional Counselor and currently sits along with Tony Chahadi with the Marketing and Communications Committee. So Steve will take questions following his presentation. So please, once again, use the chat function and send your questions to Tony directly so that he can moderate the Q&A at the end of tonight's session. So without further ado, here is Steve Ho, and thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Miller, for that kind introduction. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's webinar. And let me start to share my screen. Let's begin. All right. Well, once again, thank you to our friends at Nobel Biocare for helping to make this evening possible. I do have the privilege of serving as the Ontario Regional Counselor together with Miller and Tony and other esteemed colleagues that are with us this evening. And I can truly say that they have the best interests of Canadian oral surgeons at heart. And they serve tirelessly to safeguard the profession and all of our interests. With regards to disclosure, I just want to start by saying I am a co-founder of a few OMFS clinics and also medical clinics. I do own businesses that serve OMFS practices, and I will mention some of these businesses in the course of our discussion this evening. So I always like to start with the summary because I want us to be able to know where we're heading in this discussion. And I do feel that through the pandemic, I've identified a major structural problem that exists in the specialty of OMFS. And, you know, I think that this structural problem needs to be defined because if we have an improper diagnosis of the problem, then we may not necessarily have the right solution set. And so by refocusing on the problem correctly, I do believe that our solution set changes. I do think that COVID has given not just our profession, not just our specialty, but the entire world an inflection point to change. And I do think that technology-based growth strategies to maximize labor arbitrages do represent the future of OMFS practice. Now that's a mouthful, and I will define and bring light to what that actually means from a next steps perspective. So, you know, I was just reflecting when I saw Miller, you know, show some of the faces that are part of this organization earlier tonight, that I always see myself as a, you know, I'll be forever the junior resident, looking at my OMFS colleagues with admiration and being proud to be counted amongst the profession and the specialty. And I do think about daily the sacrifices that OMFS represent on the front line of care, and perhaps oftentimes the last line of care, and oftentimes thanklessly and sacrificially. And so I do feel that, you know, it's a privilege to be able to serve the specialty. During COVID, I did actually go through many of these phases. I definitely went through the toilet paper hoarding phase and the food and medicine hoarding phase in the fear zone. And then I started to observe what was happening to our world. And I started to realize that opportunities did exist for us to better understand the challenges of the way that we will be doing business now and into the future. And I do also think that in the growth opportunity phase now that I'm firmly entrenched in the pandemic and managing to come out of it, I do think that I'm developing a clearer picture of what's next and how, as a specialty, we might be able to take the opportunities to change and make things better and be more impactful within our scope of practice. So let's talk a little bit about structural problems. So what exactly is a structural problem? A structural problem is, basically like a chain reaction of events, right? And so we can imagine with the Leaning Tower of Pisa being built on soft foundation, over time, you will have progressive lean and ultimately you will have collapse. And I feel this every day. I feel it because when I think about my own OSA and I think about my own genetically undergrown, underdeveloped maxilla, I have structural problems that are a result of my airway. And that's a dynamic situation that I manage and I love to help other patients manage. And oftentimes it's wonderful to connect the dots and to be able to give that patient an aha moment of why they have a phenotype that includes not only medical manifestations, but also physical manifestations and certainly dental manifestations as well. So when we talk about structural problems, these are things that are predictable as an outflow of the way that things are set up. This is a title slide of a presentation that I gave to the MNP organization. So I'm sure you're aware, MNP is $1 billion accounting firm. They are Canadian owned, and they are the fourth largest accounting firm, but the one that's the largest nationally. MNP represents thousands of dentists nationally. And I had the opportunity to actually speak impassionately to all of their accountants that look after dentists and medical doctors, but specifically wanted to have a message to the accountants that were looking after dentists. And this happened in April during the earlier phases of the pandemic. It should be known actually that M&P has two branches. M&P has their LLP, which is their accounting firm, and they also have M&P Limited, which actually is a debt consolidation firm. So they're a structured insolvency firm. And what did I say to M&P? Well, I basically said, when I looked at the data that was coming back from, at the time, the first economy that was opening after the pandemic, which was China, they started to see 30% decreases in top line revenue. And when I started to look at the data from the dental industry, I became very concerned because really there's about a 30% margin. So with a 30% decrease in top line revenue, I was worried that in fact, many dentists and certainly maxillofacial surgeons would struggle. So this was the call to action that I gave our colleagues that were accountants serving the dental industry. I said, of all the dentists that you serve, you have their tax returns and you can query their cash returns, their cash positions in their practices. And you can actually draw a line and you can say, if all of these practices have prolonged periods of decreased top line revenue of 30%, how many of these practices are going to be in positions where they're going to be fine and they're going to be able to tread water, as it were, and hold on? How many of them are actually so cash rich that they might even be able to grow? And how many of them, unfortunately, because their physical, because the practice net worth is tied to the net worth of the physician or the surgeon, how many of them will actually run into an insolvency issue? And I basically said to the accountants, I said, don't just do the minimum. Don't file just tax returns and try to save me a % of interest here and there. What you should do is you should be forward looking and serve your customers, act as the CFO for these dental companies and warn them about either opportunities and say, you have an opportunity to grow, or, you are at risk. Well, thankfully, I think that was a little bit overstated. And I think that, many of the, the balance sheets turned out to be better, than what the results coming out of China showed. But nevertheless, I think it talks about the benefit of thinking ahead and thinking about problems structurally on a population level or on a national level. So now I want to focus that same type of thinking onto the OMFS market in Canada. And, there were a number of people that have reached out to me at different phases and asked me to either partner in their business or, be involved in the acquisition of their business. And I discovered something. I discovered that, most of our OMFS colleagues, because of the fact that they represent almost the last line of care and are in fact so giving, oftentimes they are doing things for their communities, for their colleagues, that do represent sacrifice. And some of this sacrifice actually comes at the cost of profitability. And what I also discovered is that many of these colleagues didn't really know if their offices were in fact profitable, or even how to measure profitability. And I thought, well, let's examine that. And so, let's realize now actually that we don't have data for OMFS practices nationally. I inquired of the CDA, I inquired of CAOMS, I inquired of OZOMs, and unfortunately, we do not have national data on the financial health and the financial position of most Canadian OMS practices. But we do have some data coming from the United States. So for example, this is a 3 operatory practice in Albany, New York, with an annual collections of $365K, with an average overhead of 30%. And you can see these are very characteristic of US, type practices, right? It's a relatively small freestanding building, probably older real estate. And you can also see the glaring fact that they do not require RNs to run their sedations, right? They need dental assistants. And I know that that is true of some jurisdictions within Canada, but by and large, not necessarily true of all jurisdictions in Canada. And I think the reason why the overhead is so favorable in this case is because of the different regulatory standards, and in fact, perhaps the lower regulatory standards that exist in the United States versus Canada. So what we can see is that in the United States, where typical OMFS practice overheads run between 30 and 60%, in Canada, they typically run a little higher. In fact, the lowest percentage that I have seen in my, I would say 24 assessments is really about 38%. And I've even seen overheads run higher than 60%. But at the same time, I know that in most jurisdictions, associates are making anywhere from 40 to 50%. And so if the owner surgeon were to pay him or herself at the market rate, in fact, there may not be any profit left. And that leads me to an assumption that if, in fact, the total profitability of an OMFS practice is only about 10%, then we realize actually that the margin's very thin. And it's very easy, and I'm sure all of this has happened to you at one time or another, when a staff member comes and says, "Doctor, can I please have $1 an hour raise?" And we think, what's $1 an hour? Well, $1 an hour translates to $2,000 a year. And you do that a few times, year over year, and it's very quick to eat up that 10% margin. And so, of course, although the OMFS do safeguard the profession, there is a rising team, right? And the rising team is that of the general dentist. And the general dentist has a superpower, and the general dentist is in fact holding that superpower, and that's the toothbrush, or in essence, hygiene. So the superpower of the general dentist is arbitrage, and I'll define what that is. It's the simultaneous buying and selling of labor in order to take advantage of differing prices for the same asset. In essence, the general dental practice has the power of a hygiene practice, which obviously you're aware is absent from an OMFS practice. Why is that significant? Well, let's take a model of a OMFS practice with a top line revenue of $1 million. And let's contrast that to a GP practice with a top line revenue of $1 million. Well, we do know that, in general terms, OMFS are able to produce outproduce a GP dentist hour for hour. And so we can see that, right? But then because the OMFS office cannot rely on revenue production other than fellow OMFS, well, then an associate is factored in. Whereas in that same GP office, they have hygienists. And so the equivalent of 1.2 full-time hygienists billing $200 an hour essentially is a top-line revenue of $500,000. And so typically OMFS practices, let's say, run a lower overhead than a GP office. You can see actually that the labor cost element, paying the associate at 40%, is actually significantly higher than the labor cost of paying the hygienist. And though the OMFS owner, surgeon, may actually take home a larger salary than the GP colleague, you can see that the amount of retained earnings, once you factor in the lower labor costs, is higher on the GP office. Now, if someone were to assess this business and say, if I were to buy this business tomorrow, and I'm an OMFS, do I have any certainty that I can make, that I can operate the business passively? And the answer is no. You'd basically have to work it as an oral surgeon. Whereas if I bought that GP office, I'd be able to passively continue to make money on that hygiene revenue. And that's why the business value of an OMFS office doesn't attract as high a multiple as that of a GP office. The GP office, in essence, is like a little hygiene machine that keeps on producing revenue for the owner. And that is the reason why, in essence, the GP office is a much more powerful arbitrage engine or revenue engine. And then the enterprise value or the business value of the GP practice is much higher. Well, in many ways, that seems to be, an interesting point, but not a very significant point when one thinks about it, except that when you add arbitrage value together and you consolidate it, then it becomes very significant. And then what you see is when you Google oral surgery or you Google wisdom teeth or dental implants, you can see that the GP colleagues in our markets are out marketing us on the internet, right? And that's why there's a shift. And essentially, there's expansion of services. So, we've always, been surprised, right? Because, we'll frequently have a patient come to our practice where the patient says, "Oh yes, doctor, my dentist tried to get this tooth out for an hour. They were unsuccessful. They sent me over to your office, and you took it out in 10 minutes." Right? That's something that we live every day, and we as oral surgeons wonder, why would a general dentist do that and risk their personal reputation, but also how can they possibly make money trying to take a tooth out for an hour? And the reality of the situation is actually it's framed the other way. These are not hungry dentists. These are dentists that have 3 hygienists scaling teeth behind them, and they're making money while trying to try these new procedures. And so what you see is with this labor arbitrage, there's actually a shift in marketing dollars. There's a shift in services in oral surgery and other specialty services into the GP office. And that is not a result of GPs not being busy. It's the opposite. It's the result of GPs actually having excess cash flow and being able to deploy this in terms of courses and equipment. And now, as they improve operations, now in-house digital lab services, sleep apnea services, all on 4 services. And what you're seeing is an erosion of what previously was things that fell within OMFS scope of practice and occurred primarily within the OMFS office that now is going into the GP office. Now, it's even more significant when you take this money, right? And in the same way that, a economic boom in China affects my housing value in Canada, when you consolidate money and you concentrate it in the field, you can have very significant shifts, right? So, some of our best and brightest recently joined what in essence is the arbitrage, the collecting of hygiene revenue that produces a pot of money that allows the purchasing of some of our best and brightest in our field. So this produces a real structural problem. And that structural problem is particularly magnified in the case of the solo owner-operator. The solo owner-operator that spent a lifetime building their brand and their value, and now it's time to bring an associate into the office. But because the net profitability might actually be quite low, because they've made quality-driven decisions to invest in their office, to invest in equipment, to not cut corners, to hire an extra RN so that sedations are smoother or safer, now they find it difficult to pay market rates for associates. And so what choices do they have? Do they hire at a loss, which actually eventually causes some type of souring of the relationship, because the owner operator, while wanting to sacrifice to bring an associate in to build them up, oftentimes I don't know that the associate appreciates that the sacrifice that the owner operator has taken. Or the other option is to underpay the associate, which isn't necessarily the best way to start a long-term relationship as well, and perhaps might mean that the associate might go for greener pastures. And so it's a real structural problem. And so ultimately the question is, as the OMFS owner in your practice, how do you pay yourself compared to the associate rates going in your area? Are you paying yourself more than what you would pay an associate? If so, great. Because really that extra that you're paying yourself represents enterprise value, that if somebody assessed your business, they would say, doctor, you've built a business that creates net positive revenue, and there is a value to that, and I'm happy to pay you a multiple of that value. Or are you basically paying yourself compared to the associate rate and still not making money? Well, unfortunately, then your practice is essentially a job or a not-for-profit. And if you're paying yourself less than what you'd have to pay an associate to actually backfill you for that time, unfortunately, then you're running a non-registered charity. So we all remember this quote, and we also know, the circumstance that this quote was spoken into. It's the end of the Second World War. And obviously, there's a emergence and the recharacterization of what type of people, the world can become as a result of, such a terrible tragedy. And I do think that we as OMFS have the same opportunity. And I think what's interesting is, we have always seen ourselves as technical specialists, right? I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about, technical exchange and how can we do a procedure so that we can transform a 96% success rate into a 98% success rate. How can I modify, the surface, or how can I use a different bone graft to, enhance my success rate? And I think the key is, while these things are wonderful and great, I think if we want to transform ourselves and take advantage of this opportunity that presents itself, and to address the core structural problem in our organizations, we have to think of ourselves not just as technical specialists, because in a way that's like a set of golden handcuffs. It really forces us into a certain idea, but rather to think about ourselves as on a journey of starting as a technical specialist, but then growing into a business specialist in our field, and being able to leverage our experience, our technical skill, in a way that actually builds our organization and builds the members of our organization around us. And I think that's always been a barrier. We've always told ourselves, we're not business people. I don't know if that is necessarily the proper narrative. And so I do think that we have an opportunity to digitally transform. So, digital transformation is the integration of technology into all areas of business and fundamentally changing how we operate and deliver value to customers. And so, you can imagine what's happened and how restaurants have digitally transformed during the pandemic. I can't understand why a restaurant these days would not offer some type of delivery service that's mediated through a DoorDash or a Uber Eats or something like that. So that's digital transformation of a business. But it also requires the flexibility of the members of the organization, the decision makers of the organization, to challenge their status quo, to experiment, to try it out, to be willing to get comfortable with the fact that, yeah, maybe DoorDash doesn't work, maybe it's Uber Eats, or maybe it's a different platform altogether. So, what's interesting is that when we look ahead, and this is fairly expensive dental research that comes from Smart Tech Market Publishing, and they actually look ahead at the growth of the industry. And I always feel that, if we want to plot the right course for our profession, for our specialty, for our practice, for our career, we need to look ahead at where the ball will be or where the puck will be. And in essence, it's telling us that if we look at it, the growth will be in services. So what does that mean? It means that, the previous models of buying hardware and software for our practices isn't necessarily the best way to digitally transform our practices, but to basically buy a service, right? And so in the restaurant example, it didn't make sense necessarily for a restaurant to develop a piece of software and roll it out or trial it during the pandemic. It maybe made sense for them to sign on to a platform that could offer that takeout service as something that was built in. And that's the sort of thing that we're talking about, is to not necessarily think about the transformation of your practice necessarily by purchasing a lot of technology or purchasing a lot of software, but what things can we use in the industry to leverage the fact that the world is transforming. And I personally developed a bit of a mantra, and this has been something that I've signed with my emails, which is to serve dentistry through strategy, to basically to test and learn, to see what works, to see what doesn't work, and then to see if we can come up with simple solutions to complex clinical problems. And we'll frame those clinical problems in a moment. But then also the question is, how can we scale it to multiple offices? How can we share this technology? How can we benefit each other as colleagues and as fellow practitioners? And then how can we use it to actually boost the labor arbitrage models within our practices? Because we don't have hygiene, but are there other ways that we can boost our enterprise value that that similar to the hygiene effect in general dentistry would actually boost our enterprise value? So the question is, why bother? Why bother? Why should I innovate? What's the threat? What's the risk? Well, I think this is an example. And thankfully, this example is not happening to our specialty. This is happening to our orthodontic colleagues. So in 2005, the Journal of Clinical Orthodontics highlighted this new approach to an orthodontic practice. And what happened was this orthodontist said, with the rise of Invisalign, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a second office that's not in the suburbs, not another 3,000 square foot office in the suburbs where my primary office is, but I'm going to build a new office, in the downtown pedestrian mall area of the city. And it's expensive real estate, so I'm going to take a small amount of square footage, but I'm going to change the way that I basically deliver my services. A lot of it will be a simplified, stripped down version, a little bit more spa-like, less dental chair environment, and much more Invisalign, right? Because Invisalign was rising as a treatment alternative in 2005. Well, fast forward now to 2019. What is this? This is the business concept that Smile Direct Club has in CVS pharmacies in the United States. So it's a small kiosk, but really this is the same evolved concept, but obviously with much more technology. And the person that's actually delivering the service isn't even an orthodontist anymore. It is probably a hygienist that's doing the scanning and then essentially, closing the sale. And then it goes on from there. So we can see that, disruptive innovation mediated by technology is certainly possible. And the concern is, of course, that it could happen to us. Now, most of the large Omfs practices, if we look historically back, actually arose in the 1980s. And why? If we were to think about the reason why, it really parallels the inception of implantology. And there's been a duopoly initially of oral surgeons and periodontists doing the bulk of the implants. And every year with the growth of the implant market, year over year, the revenues that track the implant placement would support the growth and the expansion of those offices. But of course, we all know that this is changing. There's a variety of technical reasons why that's the case. That allows GPs to perform procedures, much like Invisalign allowed non-orthodontists to perform orthodontics. But the reality is the technology is changing. It's becoming mass market, as it were, and it's quite easy for a general dentist to place implants nowadays. And so that drive that powered the growth of large OMFS practices is now waning. And that dollar value, that labor arbitrage is shifting. And so that's why there is a structural problem that we are facing. So let's talk about the pioneer thinking in digital transformation in dentistry and OMFS. So the first little bit is that when we all went to dental school, we had no idea what the word workflow meant. And it's not because we, skipped the class, the workflow class. It's because it just wasn't a dental term. But over the last few years, we really can't escape the fact that there's a term called workflow. And it's really because people are now starting to look at dentistry like manufacturing, like a manufacturing process. And the basis of the software workflow in its inception was basically a automation software. Can we take a repetitive process and use technology to automate it? And can we think of it like a product? Patients coming in one end, a product coming in at the other end, automating the portions of it that we can, maximizing the quality and the consistency, and minimizing the waste. Well, actually, when we look at conventional lean thinking, so Six Sigma lean thinking, and you actually look at what makes a difference in an organization, ironically, the two things that we instinctively do as clinicians. So for example, my revenue, my business, through COVID has gone down. The webinar that was delivered by the previous speaker just last month talked about top line revenue, right? Let's open for more hours. Let's do more procedures, right? That's known as blue collar productivity. And unfortunately, top line revenue as a driver of percentage improvement or blue collar productivity is known to be strategically less likely to make a difference in terms of how much better your business performs, how much more enterprise value you actually bring. In fact, some of the other things that involve the structure of the organization or the strategy of the organization can leverage a much greater difference. And this was more explored in a book by Sam Bari, who is a dentist in Jacksonville, Florida, who actually learned about lean manufacturing and applied it to his practice. And in 2007 was awarded the world's first lean dentist. And he wrote a book that talked about, lean manufacturing is really not so much a technical reality. It's more of a culture change. And I want to emphasize that he leads his organization different than most conventional dentists would lead their organization. And he does think about his practice as a system, and he follows the product from the entry door to the exit door. But, together with his team, he breeds a culture of flexibility, of adaptability, of being willing to test and learn. And, that's historically been something that is difficult for the OMFS mindset. I mean, we optimize, right? We don't like to deviate. We like to add an extra RN so we can be extra safe. Testing and learning and not succeeding doesn't seem like a classic OMFS approach. But the interesting thing is, I do believe that this is the path forward. And this was further substantiated by a white paper, a research paper written by Hamid Shafi and Norman Furchow. So Norman Furchow is the president of Porsche Consulting, and Hamid Shafi is a prosthodontist that teaches at George Washington University in Washington. And he examined why OMFS practices were losing ground when it came to basically the proportion of full arch restorations to entities like ClearChoice in the United States. And he talked about the pitfall of the conventional oral surgery culture, which is that it's very militaristic, and in a way, it's an expression of the way that we're trained as oral surgeons, right? We have the junior resident that essentially catches all the crap that flows downhill and is meant to deal with it. And then you have, obviously, the increasing ranks of surgeons, and at the top you have the attending, right? And that's essentially the way that the military is organized, and that's essentially the way that we've been trained. So in a way, it's not surprising that we still have this very hierarchical organization in our practices. But the challenge with it, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, is that we become that decision maker, and everything passes through our eyes, and that leads to a bottleneck. And the reality is, we have good days, we have bad days. We have, periods in our life where things are going swimmingly and we're positive. And then we have periods in our life where we have challenges, and we don't necessarily make the best decision. We're not necessarily the person to motivate others. And what eventually happens is that, this system is actually demotivating for staff. And when you lose a key staff member, I'm sure you've experienced this, we're in this cycle of retraining people to do the same things that, somebody that just left our organization had. And so therefore, the key is to change the culture of the organization. And Hamid Shafi called it operational excellence. Sam Bari had a different term for it. But really, in essence, it's a startup culture mentality. It's sort of that sense of growth, that sense of excitement, that sense of anything's possible. And he talked about that as the missing ingredient. So he identified that in organizations like ClearChoice, they had this as a secret sauce, as it were. And this, in many ways, was growing and becoming much more effective to deliver services like All on 4 versus surgeons that were using traditional systems. And, as the technology was evolving, as we were learning more about full arch solutions and new techniques were being involved, these organizations, because of their culture, were able to adapt and change and maintain their advantage. And, in the context of our discussion tonight, can easily add different labor arbitrages, can add different members of the team that can bring value where, the amount that you pay that team member is actually less than the value that they create, which actually improves your bottom line. So I developed this framework, this PPTK framework, with a consultant friend of mine. So a consultant friend had worked in most of the large consulting practices, and I had asked him, I said, if I came to you and I hired you, I think at the time he was with Deloitte, and I said, if I were to pay you thousands of dollars, you and your team, to come into my practice, what would you tell me? And essentially he said, well, it's actually kind of a playbook. And this was the way that, we sort of distilled it. So anytime you want to transform an organization, you break it up into 4 steps. The first step is the people. And what you want to do is you want to have a culture change. You want to create a culture of a can-do culture, a startup culture, a motivational culture that's based on skills, values, and behavior. But you want to also examine the processes. Where are the redundancies in your system? And do you have efficiency between the machines and the people? What are the machines that you use? What are the software tools that you use? How do you control the data that runs between your organization? And then finally, what is your strategy? What is your big view in the long run? Where do you want to go? And that's why I do feel that for the purposes of this webinar, I wanted us to define the problem clearly, because we have identified that the main structural risk for OMFS practices is that we don't have a labor arbitrage. And so structurally speaking, we need to add a labor arbitrage to safeguard our practice values so that we remain relevant. So let's talk about people insights. I do think that it's important to remove that hierarchy if possible, to introduce a startup culture where everyone brings value. I think it's important to be the same person when the patient's awake as when the patient's asleep. I think we have to allow for mistakes. We have to allow, that CDA that's doing our digital impressions to fail and to say, it's all right, just go ahead and do another digital impression. No big deal. From a process perspective, distribute the value generation. You should not be the one that's digitally scanning. You should not be the one necessarily doing all phases of the discussion with the patient. And value can be created in-house or external. Think about Invisalign. Invisalign is taking a lot of the value that previously was created in-house in an orthodontic office and externalizing that. And in many ways, when we do VSP, for example, we have basically externalized the value creation for the VSP process. We didn't need to necessarily buy orthognathic software and buy a machine to 3D print splints. That was a fairly seamless example of externalizing value creation. And obviously, just like Invisalign has the ability to separate treatment design and delivery, and VSP is the same, I think we can look for other ways to separate treatment design and delivery. Well, technology is changing very rapidly. And, thankfully, though, hardware pieces are reaching a point of maturity, and they're easier to master than software for dentistry. So think about your CBCT. We're pretty much at a point where, by and large, pretty much every CBCT machine is the same. And we're sort of getting to that point in intraoral scanners, with them being a little bit, I would say, 3 years behind the CBCTs and becoming, largely the same. Digital outsourcing is growing, which is exactly what we saw from the data, right? And where the market research was telling us. And that's basically, equivalent of VSP or implant planning that can be outsourced. And let's talk about long-term strategy. Let's look for arbitrage opportunities in OMFS. Let's reimagine a future where it's not based necessarily on your training, but the services that you're offering, right? Let's imagine that there are ways to grow the bottom line, the net profitability of an OMFS office that doesn't necessarily involve you doing the work and isn't necessarily based on things that maybe you trained in. And let's perhaps take a disease-based approach and not a training-based approach in how we structure our practices. What are some easy improvements? What are some low-hanging fruit? Well, I think every one of us, we walk out of a consultation, whether it be for wisdom teeth or simple extractions or implant placement, and we say, boy, I was just on repeat, right? I literally have said that same spiel, I don't know how many times. And honestly, I try to make it as fresh sounding as possible, but it gets pretty stale pretty quickly. Another arbitrage that's pretty simple and that, our colleagues in Alberta have figured out ahead of us, I would say, is, with the addition of a facility fee in Ontario, the anesthesia fee really does represent an arbitrage. And so there's definitely a trend in our professions towards more GA days and bringing in outsourced providers for anesthesia and making an arbitrage on their salary. Immediate implants. Definitely the previous speaker, I believe was Dr. Miller, talked about the efficiencies of same-day implantology. And so you need an implant system that understands primary stability and insertion torque, and really Nobel is tops when it comes to that. And they think about that all the time. And then full arch conversions. Now, everybody thinks about full arch conversions. Yeah, there's a few pain points there, but really, if you think about it, that's a labor arbitrage on a denturist. If you had a denturist come in and you could actually profit off the services of the denturist. A lot of these full arch conversions aren't necessarily coming from GP colleagues, and some of them you might identify just in the course of, patient walking into your office and they don't have either a practitioner that really has the appetite for it, or they don't want to go chairside on the day of conversion. And so there's an arbitrage opportunity by hiring a denturist in-house. Now, in the startup vernacular, there's a term called a co-founder. And a co-founder is a term that exists to give equal credit to multiple people who start a business together, right? So if you think about, Microsoft, right? There were two, right? And Google, there were two. And it's because the co-founder is a part of the vision of the startup because they have the skills that the founder is lacking. Now, the question is, can a co-founder actually be software? Can a piece of software understand the pain points that you experience day to day and have that understanding built in to the automation? And I believe the answer is yes. And so if someone understands the pain points that hold back an OMFS office from transformation and can parse it out into a framework like PPTK and then bake that into the software, I think there's an opportunity to automate a lot of the processes and also facilitate the transfer of information, which might actually improve efficiency. And so this is a little project that I've been working on for a few years. And I have a wonderful partner in this that has experience in building consent and virtual consultation systems for hospitals. And the interesting thing is this might mitigate the need to constantly repeat ourselves because there's a generic phase of consent and we can get the patient to do that, right? Whether on their mobile device or on their tablet or on the computer or whatever it may be. And then there's a specific phase of the consultation where we actually bring it back and we say to the patient, okay, now you understand generically what all on four represents. Now you understand, what general anesthesia is. Now you understand this and that. Let's actually now bring in the imaging. Let's bring in the treatment plan, and let's have a video chat that we can record and we can basically confirm that we've talked about everything. And let's test the patient's understanding of the informed consent process by basically having them answer a questionnaire about the material that they've seen. And let's make it a process that can happen asynchronously from your day, so they can watch an all on four video or, another informational video. They can read the consent form, they can sign it. Because a lot of times we feel that by spending this time with the patient, we've safeguarded ourselves against the risk of informed consent. Well, yes and no, right? I think, having something much more technological will probably help alleviate our days and alleviate the repetition of the process. So, that's an example of how to use technology and that framework of transformation where you can actually use, let's say, your assistant or your front desk person over technology to alleviate and make your day much more efficient while safeguarding some of the medical legal risk for you. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about, immediacy and what Nobel Biocare has to bring about that. So I do think that, the fact that Nobel is helping to bring the Medit I-500 to the marketplace, it's clear in a way the best value when it comes to intraoral scanning. And this is not just Nobel's reviews. I've watched a lot of reviews online, but the fact that we can have the DTX portal, the DTX clinic, which basically represents a landing spot for all type of 2D, 3D intraoral photography. This would allow basically one point of contact for us to tie into if we were doing virtualization of our consults. And we can pull up the patient models, we can pull up the patient imaging, we can have a discussion. The other efficiency that is gained in Nobel's thinking is, reality is most of us oral surgeons don't necessarily like to do full guided. We like to actually do pilot guides for our guided surgery if we use pilot guides. And having the temp shell allows flexibility in not necessarily having complicated tooling for having an immediate restoration, but it also allows some fluidity in the angle and deviation. Obviously, they are experts and pioneers in the area of all-on-4, and obviously they support guided technology in regards to that, as well as navigational technologies in regards to that. And obviously, the multi-unit abutments have best ease of use when it comes to this indication, and the fact that I can prep for a parallel implant and then be able to put in an active implant and be able to pivot that really quickly. That's fantastic based on bone stability at the time. And obviously I cannot say this officially because it hasn't been released for the Canadian market, but those of you that have been following the developments in Nobel know that there's a product coming out where it's basically a one drill implant. There's a drill director, there's a drill shaper, which means you have a highly simplified instrumentation kit, which is critical if you're talking about efficiencies and not confusing your staff and not needing to retrain your staff. So, I do think that Nobel thinks a lot about their product. And so I can imagine a future where we would do a virtual consult, we would tie into something like DTX Studio Clinic, and we would be able to access all of their 2D and 3D imaging and intraoral photography. We'd be able to internally, we have an internal design house for our practices, and so we can build our stacked guides. We don't do any printing because we don't feel that printing is an area that we want to get into necessarily, so we outsource our printing. We can request that printing from Nobel, or we can request it from a local lab. That is very fluid in terms of how this goes. And so, being able to leverage the power of a clinic where we have all the imaging in one site, being able to then marshal, internally through the DTX platform to ask our design center to actually do the design for one of our practices, and then through Go to actually ask that to be produced and shipped. That's perfect. We are looking for efficiencies in how we organize our days. And, now when we actually apply a framework, what you can see is that with regard to single tooth immediacy, the type of people that you need to hire for your organization, you need to be able to tell the GP offices this is something that's being done, a digital designer, whether that's in-house or outsourced, somebody that, is in charge of manufacturing. If you're in-housing it, you need a manufacturing person. If you're outsourcing it, then, that's done at the lab or centrally. The type of data that you need, the technology that you need specifically, I feel like the Medit i500 is fantastic. I've purchased 3 of them. I think the N1 implant, that one drill implant, is going to be absolutely critical. I think Nobel implants have the efficiency of drilling for different bone quality indications, and their insertion torque is supportive of single tooth immediacy. And ultimately, with technology, you can empower different members of your team. And frankly, many of the members of your team are digital natives. They're people that grew up with technology, perhaps even more so than the surgeon, him or herself. Now, as we think about full arch immediacy and the ability for the labor arbitrage in the denturist, you can see that it's important to now have a denturist as part of your team. Same things apply with regards to production if you're thinking about in-housing the digital. A little bit more complicated design, obviously, but the simplicity and the ease of use and the elegance of design in the Nobel multi-units is critical. And then ultimately, Nobel has a lot more specific marketing and can bring a lot more value when it comes to being chairside and having just the depth of experience to guide your practice through this system as you're sort of getting facile with that. So now let's talk about advanced arbitrage opportunities. These are things that might represent a second phase. If your practice is really able to, adjust quickly, these are the things that you can add. You can definitely add a digital design house and make a labor arbitrage on a designer. You can add TMJ physiotherapy as a service and make an arbitrage on the TMJ physiotherapist. You can hire either a denturist or a general dentist and to fabricate oral appliances for sleep apnea. You could sell CPAP machines out of your oral surgery practice. I've actually opened an ENT clinic. I'm doing a labor arbitrage on ENT services. We sell hearing aids out of one of the clinics that I just started up. There's an arbitrage on that. And we've started to modularize the OMFS practice. So let's talk a little bit more about modularizing an OMFS practice. This is something that represents, I think, the future. It'll decrease the construction costs of OMFS practices, which will increase the profitability and the value of OMFS practices in the future. I am decreasing our reliance on nitrogen drills and using electric drills that facilitate immediacy, taking a tooth out immediately, putting an implant in without having to set up a separate drill. Portable suction pumps. I think this is something that I just started to investigate during the pandemic. And during the pandemic, we have been locked into certain ops, and some practices that I work in don't have enough ops. And using portable suction has enabled us to grow our capacity very significantly. And I'll talk to you about a promotion that thankfully the company's been able to offer to members of the CAOMS. Oxygen concentration removes medical gas installation and builds offices much cheaper. And then now custom light solutions, I'm working on that and hopefully have something to bring to you soon about that. So I have been working with the Medela company to trial this for oral surgery. And I'm happy to say that when I contrast portable suction, particularly this model, to in-wall suction, I find that I am not missing in-wall suction. And it allows me to transform a room that isn't previously, set up with suction for suction. And now I can do minor procedures, post-operative things, local anesthesia in a room that previously I couldn't. So this allows you to expand your office, the utility of your office, and unlock more profitability during an age where it's challenging because you have to fallow rooms or because you have to, space patients apart. So what's wonderful is that if you email me, actually, I can set you up with a special program, and actually all CLMS members can trial a suction pump in their office, a mobile suction unit, and try it. And I have found it favorable, so see if you like it. So in summary, I do think that a major structural problem exists in the OMFS. I do think it's been misframed in the past. I do think it's not because dentists are not busy, that they're creeping into our profession, as it were, or our specialty. I think it's because actually they have excess cash and they are taking ground both in the form of consolidated, in the form of corporations, but also individually. They're creeping into our services. I do think that COVID gives us an inflection point to, shift our organization, shift our culture, incentivize our team members differently, get them involved in digital, get them bringing value. And I do think that technology can really shift how we do it and bring in different labor arbitrages. And I think ultimately that will let oral surgeons control the future of oral maxillofacial surgery and not have GPs or other entities control us. So with that, I want to thank Nobel. I want to thank Miller and my fellow colleagues at COMS for allowing me to have this platform today. If you have any questions or if you're interested in the free portable suction trial, just email me, steve.ho@maxfax.com, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for your excellent presentation. This brings us to the question and answer section of or portion of our evening. And Steve, quite frankly, I'm not sure where to start, but you've covered a tremendous scope of issues that affect our practices, that are pivoting points in many of our workflows, given the technologies that you've mentioned. As a reminder to our participants, you can reach me through the chat function if you want to ask any questions. I haven't received any, so I've been working on a couple of questions. So Steve, I'm going to ask kind of a leading question, but I will say that the model of efficiency that we've been sort of led to believe is that as an oral surgeon, I want to be doing surgery. I want to try to outsource as much as I can. And you would hypothetically believe that if your time is spent simply doing more surgery, sort of being able to delegate the consultation process, being able to delegate the imaging process, being able to delegate the patient flow through your office, then as an oral surgeon, fundamentally in a community oral surgery practice, you're better off focusing on doing surgery and maximizing the amount of time that you do surgery rather than doing other stuff. Do you see this as a conflicting view to the processes that you've just described?
No, I don't think it's a conflicting view. What I do believe is that ultimately, for example, take the example of oral appliances for sleep apnea. So in my practice, I have a RN that is my sleep apnea coordinator. She actually does most of the continuing care. She does a lot of the follow-ups for patients. I have a CDA that comes in and takes the impressions, and that was just with PVS. But now with digital, it'll take 2 minutes. And literally the amount of time that I have to spend relative to the revenue isn't that significant. And the reality is, I think as oromaxillofacial surgeons, you can convey a deep level of understanding that unites medicine and dentistry together. So that's one example of how your auxiliaries are creating value for you rather than just costing you, right? Based on the amount that you're paying them to suction or something like that.
One of the other things that I'm curious about is you mentioned at the first part of your talk, the issue of erosion of cash or monetary flow from specialty office to GP offices. Would you agree that that phenomenon is, number one, I think it's very difficult to quantify across the board from coast to coast in our country, and number two, it seems to me that it's extremely dependent on the population density and the type of community that you practice in. In other words, downtown Toronto versus somewhere else that's perhaps with a lesser population density and less competing variables.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. But I've even been surprised, for example, I work in the community of North Bay as well. I've been surprised that even in North Bay, where frankly every dentist is busy, there are still some practices that want to in-house oral surgery. Very surprising. And the irony is, in some communities, they're in-housing at a loss. So they would actually rather not send out the oral surgery. It's more of a philosophical change, right? Not send out the oral surgery, pay someone to come in and maybe even pay them more than, they're actually paying their overhead per se. But because they've got all this hygiene revenue, they can take a loss on it, right? It's almost like 99-cent toilet paper. Like the oral surgery is the 99-cent toilet paper. It brings people into the store.
Let's touch upon corporate dentistry for a second. And in your economic analysis, you couched an argument that stated that presented the notion that an oral surgery specialty practice is less profitable or worth less to a company. Any corporate dental entity will do, insert the name, less profitable or less valuable, than a general dental practice, right? And therefore, hypothetically, one might deduct from that you could expect as an oral surgery practice entrepreneur or practice owner that you would stand to gain less in selling your practice to a corporate entity than your colleague down the street who's a general dentist.
Yes. Yeah, that's generally the case. And that's reflected in the multiples on retained earnings that you would attract. And really very simply, I mean, it's hard to find oral surgeons. The oral surgeons they're not a dime a dozen, right? And consequently, what that means is that if I were to buy anyone's practice and I wanted to run it without working there, I would have to pay a market rate for an oral surgeon to work in that office, right? And if literally the profitability, once I've paid that associate, to work there, that's market appropriate, is nil, then really is that a business, right? I don't know that that's a business. It's making a job for somebody, but it's not really a business.
We've always had the preconceived notion that overhead of an oral surgery practice is hypothetically substantially less than the overhead for a GP office, at least traditionally. Now, if that's not the case, I mean, if that is the case, then you would think that an oral surgery practice is more profitable. But I guess in the analysis of this, you come to the conclusion of the contrary conclusion.
Well, I think it has everything to do with labor charge, right? So do not think about your meaningful overhead. Think about the arbitrage on labor value, because really we are not selling Coke, right? We're not selling cans of Coke. We're not buying a can of Coke for 10 cents and selling it for 30 cents. We are selling a service, and we are in a service industry. And so if anytime you have a service-based industry, in essence, the amount that you pay for the labor has to be less than what you sell that labor for. And if you're paying an oral surgeon 50 cents on the dollar, and it costs you 50 cents on the dollar, then essentially you've made nothing, in essence, right? And so really that's the shift, right? And that's really redefining for us what the structural issue is. And yeah. So I also want to say one more thing.
Sure.
We have modeled our practices after our hospital-based training, for better or for worse, right? The bulk of us have trained in public hospitals where, frankly, they lose money. They lose money all the time. So we maybe subconsciously have modeled ourselves after a business model that doesn't make money, unfortunately. I think we should be building our offices and modeling off our offices much more like private endoscopy clinics. Because when we think about the level of invasiveness of 95% or better of the procedures that we do, it's on the level of invasiveness of endoscopy. And endoscopy clinics that, are in our neighborhood are not built like operating rooms.
So I just got a couple of questions, but before I get to that, I might argue with you, Steve, that perhaps, from a consumer's perspective, removal of wisdom teeth might be perceived as more invasive than an endoscopy procedure. Would you not say?
I think that what we've seen and what we've tried to drive towards is a level of anesthesia that is similar to that of the endoscopy experience. So we've been trialing more open airway based anesthesia, even with outside providers, rather than closed airway.
Okay.
Now, I know that might go down a series of differences of opinion, and I recognize that there's lots of arguments on both sides, but that's that's an example.
I'm going to get to some questions from the audience, our participants. I just want to ask you one question. Is there ever a scenario where an increase in efficiency and time spent doing a procedure, i.e. a reduction in time, for example, that implant procedure that takes really not a tremendous amount of time for most oral surgeons to conduct? Do you think there is ever a trade-off between the consumer's perception or patient perception that could be negatively influenced by an extremely efficient procedure? In other words, wow, I just spent X amount of dollars to have this gentleman or woman place an implant for me in literally 15 minutes. And he was out the door, and I was talking to his assistant, and I was gone and back in my car in half an hour. Do you ever see a potential for a negative correlation between consumer perception and efficiency?
So I will answer that question indirectly. And the way that I will answer that question indirectly is reference my wife's laser eye surgery experience. She never met the surgeon that was doing the laser eye surgery. She met a bunch of, optometrists, for lack of a better word. They were all offering, sort of it was a custom consultation experience. But she literally met the laser eye surgeon 5 minutes before her surgery. He took a perio probe and flipped her, cornea off after it had been cut. The LASIK did whatever it was going to do, and he flipped it back on, right? That was 2 minutes, $5,000. I don't know, right? There was a premium experience, but the amount of time that was actually spent by the individual surgeon was highly abbreviated. But my wife does not think, I should have paid less. She's happy with the result, right? Obviously, consumer behavior is highly varied, but that's what I'll answer.
Okay. There's out of respect to the people who sent me a question, I'm just going to start at the bottom here. Here's a question: is there not much higher arbitrage potential in a relatively conflict-devoid partnership practice as compared to a solo or successful solo model?
I don't really understand the question. Is it saying that is the presumption that there's more arbitrage in a practice group versus a solo practice?
So truthfully, I'm not sure. I was having trouble understanding the question, and the devil is on screen, and I almost quoted him, but he presented himself. So our executive director, I'm going to allow him. We'll unmute him or ask him to unmute himself. Pierre, could you elaborate on your question, please?
And my question is, do you get me?
We're hearing you.
Okay. No, my question is, as a matter of fact, is there more arbitrage potential or more added value to a multi-partnership with all the pitfalls and of course the potential conflicts or what is in a multi-unit partnership as compared to a solo practice? But is there not more potential for that type of model to evolve into increased value, increased arbitrage, increased I would say flexibility, variability, and so forth, so on? And I'm not suggesting that it is. As a matter of fact, I am suggesting there is better, or I intuitively think, although just getting familiar with the arbitrage concept, but that there is more potential for leverage on that concept with a more than one person actually, and not just associates or a single associate or an associate for buying type of a relationship, but a consolidated group practice. And this being said, going all over, whether it's academic, private, hospital, and so forth, so on. I think there's, and you're getting and you're gaining and you're keeping control over your profession.
I thank you for your question, Pierre. And I think that it depends on the culture of that group practice. I mean, there are some group practices that have shifted into expanded specialties. And I can think of one in the Western, just west of the GTA here, that has expanded into other services, right? Other specialty services, endo, perio, and they're a multi-partner OMFS practice, and I think they're doing well because that's the labor arbitrage model. But I do worry about the dynamics of culture shifting because particularly in the area of digital transformation, you have the boomer surgeons, you have the Gen X surgeons that are not digital natives, you have the millennial surgeons that are digital natives, right? And it's really about the culture and the ability for maybe a millennial surgeon to drive that innovation and have the blessing, right? And the appetite for the boomer and the Gen X surgeon to be brought along. So definitely it's more fertile ground for ideas and for jumping off point for arbitrage, but it's really about how that, partnership handles its decision making. And that's the subtlety. And sometimes that does depend on the economic model of that partnership. How does a dollar, right, get split? And so those are the subtleties of it, right? And I think those of us that have lived this profession for a little longer understand the subtleties, and how much internal competition there is within that practice, right? So thank you for your question. It's very insightful.
Steve, you're familiar with
Tony
Sorry.
Excuse me, Tony.
Yeah, no.
Just for a second, because that was a lead to a second question, and I'm sorry to wedge it in, but I'm not that sorry. I'll just wedge it in, and I think you led me into, well, you're allowing me to lead with my second question, which would be, are the current partnership models, the standard partnership models with whatever they are, only expense sharing or expense and profit sharing and so forth, so on. Are these standard models not in a dire need for change and perspective and a reinvention, so as to make the partnership a kind of a much more, I would say, not only collegial, but purpose-based, rather than economic splitting and whatever other fancy formula you want to have for income sharing? Should we not work more on the philosophy of a group rather than on who's getting more out of the pie?
Yeah. So I will sort of say that, some partnerships do this really well by investing in the growth and the mentorship of the younger partners. And other partnerships maybe less so. Maybe there's even some internal competition. But I think that, the culture piece, right? The culture piece that we talked about that exists within the partners, but also exists within the staff, really that's key, right? It's really about that journey. And I do think that the millennial surgeons are looking for more than just, an economic port to hitch themselves to. I actually think they're looking for, sort of that sort of blended experience of mentorship and the reality is we can't wear all the hats, right? I can't wear a hat that, my academic colleagues wear very well. I can't do half the surgeries that Miller does, and we can really enrich each other's professional journeys. I mean, and the reality is if I have something to give from a business perspective, I'm happy to give it, and I also do think that we stand together. Like, I think the economies of scale mean that we won't be able to individually program solutions for each practice. We're going to have to, at the CAOMS level, perhaps, or even, sort of surgeon to surgeon, social network to social network, figure out a way to share technology so that we can safeguard the practice of our specialty.
Great. Thanks, Pierre, for that. Steve, given your familiarity with oral surgery generally across the country, if you had to choose one or two areas of what you called growth and services that you think would be the best fits for oral surgery, or would have the greatest likelihood to be successful, what would your recommendation be?
I think sleep apnea is an easy one. We put patients to sleep, open airway all the time. We see that patient that desaturates when you give them 5 Versed all day long, right? We have a deep understanding of medicine. We require that even on a day-to-day practice. I think there's nobody better, and I don't think the ENTs are doing a good job with it. And the sleep physicians are just pushing CPAP machines on people. And I think that, this is a bias that I have, but there's so much richness in it, and it is such a jumping off point for physio, for the TMJ, oral appliances that can involve denturists or even dentists, right? That are retiring and don't want to drill and fill anymore, and they just want to fit an appliance and talk to patients for an hour. There's a lot of opportunities in there. It also is a branching point off for imaging, for large field CBCT imaging. You end up talking to a patient, you get their kids who have the same, class 2 malocclusion that, will play out as a OSA in the future when they reach adulthood. But now, as a child, you have an opportunity to do an orthodontic procedure to finish it. I mean, it is so rich and it is so rewarding. I got to say, professionally, it is so rewarding that, I think it checks all the boxes, and there's nobody better. I've long believed that there's nobody better in medicine or dentistry to do this.
Have you considered doing drug-induced sleep endoscopy, or is that something that you do?
We are starting. And the reality is, there's two facets to that. I don't necessarily have to do the anesthesia for it, and I don't necessarily have to do the endoscopy for it. But it can occur on my premises and my facility, and it's private. So it's a revenue driver.
The first thing that comes to mind is the legality of body and the roles of different essentially provincial governing bodies that dictate what we can and can't do. And just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about some of the obstacles that might exist. I don't even know if they do or don't exist.
I don't think they exist to the extent that you believe they exist, in the sense that you can own the operations of it, but you just don't necessarily have to perform that procedure. So for example, I can own a sleep lab and I can have sleep physicians work there, but I'm not a sleep doctor and I can't read that sleep study.
Right.
But I can take a labor arbitrage on their labor.
Interesting. Great. Steve, thank you so much for, as usual, a very stimulating presentation. I'm going to turn things over to Miller to close up. Miller, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and come back on screen, please.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Steve. Much appreciated. Thank you, Pierre-Eric, for your keen questions as well. And your Wi-Fi actually was much better than most of our executive meetings, so I appreciate that, Pierre-Eric. That's good. I'm just trying to pull up my last little bit. I know for the most part, I do want to thank Nobel once again for sponsoring this. It cannot be said that without our sponsors and support from industry for our organization, we would not be able to host these types of meetings. So we are very, very thankful for the continued support of all of these webinars. Along those same lines, our next webinar is going to be March 10th. It's a Wednesday at 7 p.m. Dr. Kevin McCann is going to host it, as it's a joint meeting with the CDSA. And he has invited 2 speakers to chat to all of our membership. Dr. Hans Clark is going to discuss the Canadian evolution of cannabis and that industry, both amongst the pharmaceuticals and in pain management. And Dr. Stuart Leiblich, who we all know from Connecticut, is going to talk to us about office anesthesia emergencies. So once again, this webinar is co-sponsored by CDSA and CAOMS. And I do want to reach out and thank Kevin McCann for organizing it. Please watch for our upcoming newsletters for the links. We are going to continue to reach out to our membership to help out in whichever way they can. The next big ask is going to be for people to volunteer to be speakers, or you might be voluntold as well, to be speakers for the AAOMS CAOMS joint meeting down in Nashville. It's going to have, at the current time, both an in-person and a virtual format. And you may hear from either myself, Pierre-Eric, some of the other executive, and more specifically, Mike Shimizu and Joey Friedlich, who might be reaching out to see if we can have you as speakers for that organization. most recently, and they're going to send it out, so please watch out for this. There is a clinical course topics. So those are more small group formats where it's more of a ask the experts type theme that they are requesting participation for. And the deadline to register for that or apply for it, shall we say, because they are going to choose the different topics, is February 7th. So if anyone's on that does have a special keen interest in anything amongst the range of oral maxillofacial surgery and they want to put on a clinical course in a small group format, AMIS is looking for various presenters for that. So please nominate yourselves and apply. At this point, this concludes our webinar. I want to invite everyone to unmute their microphones, open up their cameras, have a brief social. That includes all the Nobel staff that are attending as well. And thank you again. We'll look forward to seeing each other in March. Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Steve. Much appreciated.